Thank you. All right, we're in a context where Jesus is in the temple and he is teaching and preaching, and the scribes and Pharisees and elders, the Sanhedrin, and then eventually the Sadducees as well, are trying to trip him up and find something with which they can accuse him so that they can put him to death. They're conspiring to kill him, and now momentum is picking up through that. Last class, we didn't quite get to the section on Jesus cleansing the temple, and it's actually contextually important as we get into chapter 20, and so we're going to start there. Someone, if you don't mind reading Luke 19, verses 45 through the end of the chapter.
Then he went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold there, saying to them, "It is written, my house is a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." And he was teaching daily in the temple, but the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people sought to destroy him, and were unable to do anything, for all people were very attentive to hear him.
Thank you. All right, this actually bookends Jesus' ministry. Where do we read the first time he did something like this? Did you find that? Yeah, John chapter 2. He's there in the same context, setting in regard to time of year, around the Passover, and he cleanses the temple then. There's some differences, but it bookends his ministry, and at this point escalates it to a greater degree, if you will. And so what's the ultimate problem here that he addresses? What's so bad about them doing what they're doing? And who would that challenge ultimately? What are they selling? And what's the exchange of money for? For sacrifices, right? And as you would give the temple tax, you would give your contributions, as we'll see in chapter 21 with the widow and her 2 mites. There'd be an exchange of currency to give the fitting currency for the temple. So why would that be a bad thing? Okay, that's a big part of it. They're doing it for a profit, and he calls it a den of thieves. They've made it a den of thieves, which is actually kind of the missing piece of John chapter 2. There, he especially emphasizes this next part that we're going to see, but leaves out that fact that they had taken occasion to defraud their brethren. Kurt?
It seems to indicate in John chapter 2 that it was money changers, not just, they weren't just selling the sacrificial animals
Yeah.
at a profit, but that the Pharisees or Sadducees or someone had decided that the temple would only receive money in the local currency. And so they were exchanging currency also at a profit.
Okay. What's the temple for? To worship. Yes, sir. Because you studied this. You did. No, go for it. Okay. Okay. There's a lot going on there. He calls it a den of thieves. There's dishonesty, and throughout the Old Testament you see those kinds of examples that really are images of greater injustices about those unjust scales and false weights and that kind of stuff. And so there's some things going on here. There's a more fundamental thing in regard to the temple's use that I want us to see here. If they needed to exchange money, nothing wrong with that. If they needed to buy for the sacrifice, nothing wrong with that. Were they to do that in the temple? Why? Why do we know that they weren't, Aaron?
Well,
Sure. Yes. That's fine.
I apologize.
No.
It reminds me kind of a story that I have a friend of mine that says, life is good until it hurts my pocket.
Okay.
And in this situation, this is exactly what's going on. Life is good for them because their belly and their pockets are good.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's going to change is the next verse in 47. Jesus continues to teach. As long as he's teaching in the temple, what's happening to their pockets?
Yeah.
They're not making any money.
Yeah.
And so they're not happy.
Yeah.
And the reminder is, and it goes, in my opinion, to your lesson on Sunday. God wants to be close to his people and have a relationship. Where is the place that Christ can not only have a relationship with his people, but with his Father?
Okay. Yeah.
The temple.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. I'll get to that last part especially in a minute. Yeah, right? No one knows. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And that's where I was, going toward. And then the last part of what Aaron says is what the temple's for is to draw near to God. He's wanting to be with us, and he dwells among us in that way, and them in that way, in that time. And so there's a purpose of the tabernacle, there's a purpose of the temple, and they're not in the holy place or the holiest of all, so they're in the temple courts, but it's still the temple. And that purpose was, as he says, a house of prayer. It's for worship, it's for drawing near to God, it's for offering sacrifices. But as Riley mentioned, there's no authority given for the exchange of money or the selling of those animals for sacrifice in the old law within the temple grounds, is there? There's a place for that, but it's not here. And it may have been, and so there's some other more nefarious things going on here with their being, avaricious and they're stealing from people and all that kind of stuff. But there's a more fundamental thing to this in the fact that they are using the temple in ways that are not inherently sinful. It's not inherently sinful to buy and sell for sacrifices or to exchange money or whatever, do that common business. But it is to do it in an area and in a place and in a time that was not authorized by God. Mark's account says this as well, that he would not allow anyone to carry wares through the temple, a vessel through the temple. And so you picture a person that is carrying this vessel for business. They're making a delivery or something. They got to walk all the way around the temple to get to where they're going. They see this big old open level place where they can just cut through. And so they cut through the holy place just as a matter of convenience for business. And so the word that comes to our minds, I think, is profaning the temple. They're taking something which is holy and they are using it for common purposes. And so, I think that anyone who is aware of the history of the church and the past issues that we've faced, at least my mind immediately goes to the excuses for using the Lord's money in unauthorized ways because the ends justify the means and institutionalism. And so it would work better if we pool our money together into one church. Church is given to this church, so this eldership makes use of it, or sending our money to orphans' homes and that kind of stuff. And inherently, there's nothing sinful about that and the efforts of supporting a preacher for the preaching of the gospel, but the method of it is unauthorized, and so it is sinful. And the end never justifies the means. And what we're going to see through Luke 20 is that they don't have a very good understanding of authority, nor do they really exhibit true spirituality and focus. And both of those things are going to be evident in their questions and also Jesus' exposure of their character at the end, that they're not in this to draw near to God or to serve Him or to love Him, but to just make an appearance of spirituality and take advantage of their brethren. And all of that is found in the misuse or mispractice of what God has told us to do in His law, doing things in unauthorized ways. It shows that you don't know what true spiritual service is, and it shows that you don't have a good grasp of how God communicates and how He dictates what we do and what we can't do. And that's certainly here. And Jesus comes in as a man of authority, and He drives them out. This is not a place for that. There's no authority for that here. And certainly you're taking advantage of these people as well, and you are profaning the holy place in more ways than one. And he's teaching, and they're upset about that, they're frustrated about that, but they see the people that are intent to listen to him, so they can't do anything about that. So that's when we get into chapter 20. And in chapter 20, what did they ask Jesus about as he's preaching and teaching in the temple? What authority you have for the things that you do. And so, if anything's going on in the temple grounds, who knows about it and who is okaying it or putting a stop to it? Priests, what we read there, the chief priests, scribes, and the elders, which were the three elements of the Sanhedrin. And so the Jewish rulers, the Jewish Supreme Court, they're in the know. And if something's going on in the temple, especially in this public setting, they're going to know about it. And if it's going on, that means that they have authorized it. They allow it. And I think certainly they would have been involved in a lot of this kind of thievery, as Rick alluded to as well. And so they know about this. So Jesus comes in and says, this isn't right. You ought to stop doing this. And drives them out with a kind of righteous indignation. Is that going to be is that going to set well with them? It's not, is it? And certainly there would have been a more intimate conviction with them that we know that we don't have authority for what we're doing, though they may have convinced themselves that they did to a degree. But even if it wasn't a matter of black and white, right and wrong, and it was just Jesus kind of doing this because he thought he had the right to do it within himself and had nothing to do with the law, that would have been an affront to them personally as those who have authority. How dare you stand against us and question us? So you can understand why they would come up to him and say, hey, who gave you this authority? What are you doing here? What are you up to? We're the ones with the power. We're the ones with the authority. And then what we see here is that the context actually bookends a question of Jesus' authority. Because then he'll bring up Psalm 110 about him sitting at the right hand of the Father as the one who is God. And he has then authority as his enemies are made his footstool. And they're to be submissive to him as well. And then they ask him some things about the authority of the law and such. And then the Sadducees cut in on that. But then verses 9 through 19 is a parable that has to do with a consequence to them rejecting his authority. So there's a lot about authority here in Luke chapter 20 as the Pharisees have rejected his authority and are seeking to destroy him by asking these deceitful questions. Kurt?
Jesus doesn't take them to task for it, but I'm wondering, do they have authority for more than one chief priest?
Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't even think chief priest is scriptural language. So there's a lot in that 400-year period of silence that has come into this that's foreign to the entire context of Old Testament history.
As far as I remember, in the Old
High
Testament,
priest.
there was one high priest.
Right.
He had a specific duty.
Yeah, and the chief priest is not the same necessarily as a high. There's chief priests, and so I'm not, up to date on all of that factually, but there's an obvious distinction because there's multiple there, and then there's, later on there's a distinction of that in Jesus' trial. But a lot of foreign things going on with the Israelite history at this time. Traditions came in, obviously, the Mishnah, the Talmud, all these kinds of things that are foreign to what was actually within the law of Moses and the prophets. So, good question. Wish I could have answered it better, but I hope that suffices. So they say, by what authority are you doing these things, or who gave you this authority? What they do here, and with the question about taxes paid to Caesar, is they try to put him on the horns of a dilemma, which means no matter what he answers, their aim is that they can indict him with some kind of wrong. And so if he answers, well, my authority's from God. He's claiming to be a prophet. That's blasphemy. That's arrogance. That's not true. You, of all people, after all this time claiming to be a prophet, we know they rejected John. We'll see that in a moment. But then, If he just claims, no, not necessarily from God, but I know the law, I'm a rabbi, I'm a teacher, I'm a lawyer. Well, you didn't get schooled in the Jewish law. And so you're kind of a fraud. And these people shouldn't be following you. And they kind of maybe regain some trust in the people. You shouldn't listen to him. He doesn't know like we know. And so they're posing this question. It's very deceitful and calculated. They've thought this through, though obviously not enough. And you also remember, and I think one of the questions is, what kind of authority are they asking him to present? You remember what Saul was doing in Acts chapter 9 when the Lord confronted him? What was that chapter open with? What did he receive as he goes to Damascus? Letters. He received some credentials, some authorized documents so that he could go to Damascus and take men and women back to Jerusalem, imprison them, and so on and so forth. And so, hey, we know we didn't okay this, so what are you doing? Where'd you get this from? Hoping that he would answer in a way that would, betray himself. So what does Jesus do? Yeah, poses a question back. And how far back does he look with his question? Baptism of John. Now, what did they do? And we've already seen it throughout Luke with John's baptism. They rejected it. Remember in Luke 7 and verse 30, the Pharisees and lawyers rejected the will of God for themselves, not having been baptized with the baptism of John. And what Jesus does is he kind of shifts it back to them. And in a way, he's actually putting their original question on them. Because what did John do for Jesus? He paved the way for Jesus. And he wasn't quiet about that. He pointed him out to plenty of people. This is the man that I've been talking about, who's preferred before me because he was before me, as John's gospel records it. So you ask me where I get my authority from. Well, you remember what John taught? He'll tell you the answer, but where was his authority from? And so one and the same, and it puts them on the horns of a dilemma, and they realize that, right? What was their reasoning with Jesus' question? They reasoned within themselves. Can't answer yes or no, because either way, we're telling on ourselves. What if they say it's from heaven? What does that mean? They disobeyed heaven. They disobeyed God. If they say it's from men, what's the problem? All these people that are leaning toward Jesus' side and they're getting frustrated about, they're trying to win them back over to their side, it would just confirm the more that they're not their friends. And they would have a problem with that. They perceived John was a prophet. So they said, we don't know. Neutrality is never the right answer. And we saw that earlier in Luke's gospel as well, in the gospel period, that you cannot ride the fence. If you don't choose one or the other, you actually do choose what is opposite of Christ. And that's essentially what they did. They didn't find a way out of this. And then Jesus said, I'm not going to tell you then. They're not honest in their inquiry. Comments, questions on that? Something we can learn practically for us today by that, by their question. What they have an understanding of. What's that? Yeah. Yeah, they majored in what was not even revealed, which really clouded their vision. And they asked him about his authority, right? Was that a legitimate question? I know his ulterior motives, it wasn't honest, but the question on itself is very legitimate. They knew a way we could trip up Jesus is if he's acting without authority. The Pharisees knew that. The Sanhedrin knew that. And so certainly we need to have authority. And Jesus didn't say, you know what, I don't need authority. I'm sincere in what I'm doing. That wasn't his answer. His answer was, what about John's authority? And so authority is important. It's irreplaceable, and it's necessary. Kurt?
He had actually already answered that question. His actions and his miracles and all of the things that he did in teaching the Word answered the question before they even asked him.
Yeah.
So they just wouldn't accept it.
Yeah, exactly. He's given the proof plenty of times. In John chapter 10, he told the people there, listen, if you don't believe me for what I'm saying, then believe the miracles I'm performing, and based on that, then believe what I'm saying. And so the proof has always been there. They're just not listening. They've asked for another sign time and time again. He's not going to give it to them because one sign is enough, and they just don't accept it. So then he tells this parable, and what's the parable in a nutshell? You don't have to give all the details, but anyway. Yeah. Yeah. So there's one who has a vineyard, leases it to others. They're in charge of it, and he goes to get his fruit, to receive the produce of his property. And with each of the servants, and then the other Gospels, there's even more than that in Matthew's Gospel, but here he records 3. They beat them and treat them shamefully and then wound them, so it's kind of escalating as it goes along. And then he says, they're going to respect my son, and instead of respecting his son, they kill him. And what was their motive in that? Inheritance, yes. Yeah, they're going to take it for themselves. If I kill the son, there's no one left in this inheritance. It becomes ours. That's not really airtight logic, is it? You've got the owner that's still going to have authority and power to react and respond to this injustice. So they're not really thinking clearly. And all of this is paralleled with what? Themselves. And Jesus would say as much explicitly. And he'd say it will be taken from you and giving to others that are worthy of it. And so, and they're catching on to this as it progresses. But that's the folly of them rejecting Jesus ultimately and rejecting God's Word. They have pride as Israelites, and they anticipate the Messianic kingdom. They look forward to the glorious days of the Messiah where they'd have a place of prominence as Jewish rulers. They don't understand what the Old Testament actually was foreshadowing and anticipating and prophesying of, which is why they're rejecting Jesus. But they have a great interest. Their interest is just misguided and ignorant. And they think that they can reject this man's idea of this Messianic kingdom, though there's plenty of proof that he has authority. There's no doubt about what he's been doing. They've never doubted the miracles that have been done right in front of them and then proclaimed around about. Their problem is what he stands for and how he's challenging the status quo and how he's not giving any attention to, as Ronnie mentioned, their traditions and the things that they're valuing as spiritual. He's got a completely different view of things. It's a biblical and scriptural view, and they don't like it. But they still have this kind of naivete that they can kill him and somehow still take it for themselves. There's no way that would happen. That's what sin does to us. It tries to get us to think that we can get away with something that it's unheard of. There's no way that would ever work. You might, in your own time, read Isaiah 5, 1 through 7, which uses some of the same language as Matthew's account of this, how he built a hedge around it and a winepress was dug out and built a tower. And there in Isaiah 5, the figure of the vineyard represents Judah and Jerusalem and how they did not bear good fruit. They had bad fruit. And then later on in Isaiah, I forget the chapter, but it looks forward to the true vineyard of the Messianic times when the kingdom would be established and they would bear fruit. And so you've got the servants, which would represent who? The prophets, people of God being sent to require their change and righteousness when they had been acting unrighteously. And how did the people of Israel treat the prophets through history? They killed them. They treated them very poorly. Remember in Luke 11 when he was with some lawyers, he told them that you build up the tombs of the prophets and your fathers killed them, and you bear witness that you approve the deeds of your fathers, for they indeed killed them, and you build their tombs. And so, they're guilty of the same things that their fathers were guilty of, and that they're not submitting to the prophetic word. And their fathers back then when the prophets lived killed them. Remember Stephen's sermon? That's basically what he did. He said, listen, you're just like them. They killed the prophets, you killed his son. And that's exactly, a parallel to what he's talking about here. And so they would represent the vine dressers. The servants are the prophets. And then the son, that's an easy one. In fact, In Mark chapter 12 and in verse 2, it says, he sent to them last, saying they will respect my son. I thought I had it written down. One of the synoptic gospels says only son, if you have that, or my one son. But I thought I had that down, but I don't. Anyway, that's obviously a representation of Jesus. And so then what does he say in verse 15? After he finishes the parable, he poses them a question, doesn't he? What is who going to do to who? What's the owner of the vineyard going to do to the vine dressers who killed his servants and his sons, or in his son? And so he immediately answers in Luke's account. In Matthew 21, it says, they said to him, so they answered him, he will destroy those wicked men miserably, so on and so forth. And then Jesus, evidently, as we harmonize these passages, agrees with them. Basically, you're right. He will come and destroy those vine dressers and give the vineyard to them. And then they heard this and said, certainly not. And you might wonder, well, they just gave the answer. Why are they objecting now? It's because that's what a parable does, doesn't it? If you're following the parable, you can understand the logic behind it as it is a message in physical reality that stands to illustrate a spiritual point. And so the parable of the sower. Oh, I know why the seed isn't growing on the wayside. I know it's not growing on this thorny soil and the stony soil, so on and so forth. But then you apply that as he does, and he agrees with them, and they catch on. He's talking about me here, and that's what the text goes on to say. Then, of course, they're going to object. You're going to take it away from us and give it to someone else. And who's that someone else referring to? I think that that's one of our questions. When he says he will give it vineyard to others, who are the others? Okay? That might be an initial thought, certainly. But would there be Jews in the kingdom? Yeah, there would be, wouldn't there? And so this is not physical anymore. This is not national. This is another nation. He's going to give it to another people, and he's giving it to the spiritual Israel. In fact, in Matthew's Gospel, in chapter 21 and verse 43, it says, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to a nation bearing fruits of it. It would include the Gentiles, but he's talking about the Israel of God, spiritual Israel. And you Jews can be a part of that if you accept the Christ. Then what does he quote from? Psalm 118, 110, 118 later, right? No, 110 later. Psalm 118 right here. No, you're fine. You're just throwing me way off, Carl. So 118, which talks about a stone, builders rejecting it, becoming the chief cornerstone. What would they be trying to build? Messianic kingdom. They're working for this. They're trying to get to the kingdom. They want to see the kingdom and its glory. That's what they're in charge of, to follow God and to lead Israel to those glorious days. Whenever that's going to come, that's what we're looking forward to. We want our reward. We want to be a part of that. And what stone do they reject? Which is what? The most important stone. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? The cornerstone, as we're all aware of, would be the stone that all the walls are measured by. It's like the standard. It is the measurement for the rest of the building. It is the most important piece of the foundation. You can't build the rest of the building without it, and they rejected it. And then he says, whoever falls on that stone will be broken, but on whomever it falls, it will grind him into powder. So you have some people that should have accepted the most important stone. They're rejecting it. But he's still the cornerstone. God makes him the chief cornerstone. And so there's still a safe haven for people, isn't there? There's still some positive in this. Notice in 1 Peter chapter 2, you're going to see this passage quoted. You're also going to see a couple other passages quoted. And it manifests the goodness and severity of God. It manifests that also with the gospel it can save or it will destroy those who reject it. Jesus came to save, but he's going to come in destruction for those who reject him. So in 1 Peter 2 and verse 6, speaking of Jesus, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect and precious. He who believes on him will by no means be put to shame. That's a good thing. That's from Isaiah 28:16. And then the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, Psalm 118:22, as we just read. And then a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. They stumble being disobedient to the word to which they were also appointed, Isaiah 8 and verse 14. Those Isaiah passages in context speak about how they were putting their trust in men instead of putting their trust in God that would not disappoint them. And when they put their trust in men, what would be their safe haven in God actually becomes their destruction. And that's what he's saying here. If you fall on that, it's a stone to build a life on. It's a stone to build the kingdom on. It's a stone to find salvation with. But if you fall on it instead of building on it, you fall on it instead of falling in line with it, then you're broken. But on whomever it falls, it will grind him into powder. J.W. McGarvey offered this idea. The stone, of course, represents Jesus. That's true. And the two fallings set forth his passive and active state. And I think that's what he's saying here. If I fall on the stone, I'm broken. Remember in John chapter 3, he talked about how he didn't come to condemn the world, but that the world would be saved through him. But then he says, listen, if you reject me, if you don't believe in me, you're condemned already. Did Jesus have to do anything for that to happen? That was a passive thing. So you reject Jesus as they're doing now. He's not doing anything. He's not condemning you verbally. He's not sending you to hell right now. All he's doing is preaching the truth. You're rejecting him. He's just kind of passively trying to save you. That's active, but passively in this condemnation, you're being condemned. And so you're falling on that stone, you're broken. Now, what happens if you don't come back to him? If you don't change your mind, as some people did on the day of Pentecost? There will be a time when Jesus is active in his condemnation. Remember in Hebrews 9, he says that he'll appear a second time apart from sin for salvation. Well, that second time for salvation is also a second time for what? Judgment, for destruction. And so you've got this idea of you falling on him. He's a stumbling stone. He trips you up. You don't like what he's saying, and it breaks you. It's terrible. It's fatal. You die spiritually. But eventually he's coming in final judgment. And if you're still offended at him, it's going to be terrible. You'll be ground into powder. Kurt. In verse 18? No. I think in verse 18 it parallels right there with the stone which the builders rejected. They're rejecting him. Now, certainly in a sense, he breaks us in regard to breaks our will. He puts us into subjection. You kind of think about that in Paul's language in 2 Corinthians when he talks about, I believe it's in chapter 3, that he leads us captive in Christ. And so he captures us, he conquers us so that we can be living for him, certainly. And so they try to lay hands on him. They know that he's speaking this about them, but the people are all about Jesus at this time, so they can't. So we got to move on. All right, then now they're frustrated. They've been frustrated. He just said that, you're guilty of killing God's son. You're going to be judged for this. This is going to be terrible. And so they watch him. They've been watching him, but they watch him even more. And then, as we see in Matthew's account, they send some spies here. They send who? The Pharisees send some of their disciples, but who else is in the mix of this? Remember when they ask about taxes paid to Caesar? In Matthew's gospel? I believe maybe in the Herodians. Who are the Herodians? Yeah, friendly to Rome. We're good with Rome as long as they allow the Herods to rule in these areas, right? And so we're pro taxes to Caesar. Did the Pharisees and the Herodians, were they allies? Except for here, when they've got a common enemy in Jesus. So there's so much pretense going on with this. There's so much negativity behind this and evil surmising about this, and all of this kind of stuff is going on. And so they pretend to be righteous, acting like they're actually asking with pure motives. They're curious about the truth, and they kind of butter him up a little bit. We know you teach rightly. and that you show personal favoritism. Teach the way of God in truth. And so what they're saying is, listen, we know you're righteous, we know what you're teaching is true, and we know that you have too much integrity to alter your answer so that you don't offend Rome or so that you don't offend your countrymen. So answer straight. They're setting him up. And they said, is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar? In fact, in Mark 12 and verse 15, they add, shall we pay or shall we not pay? And this is another thing where they think Jesus answers either way, he's going to be wrong. What if he says, yes, you must pay taxes to Caesar? Simply. Okay. What kind of a man was Caesar? What kind of a Roman government was Rome? Evil, 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 evil. And you're supposed to be spiritual, and you're contributing to this. You're okaying this by paying taxes. And your money can't go to the Lord now if you're given to Rome. But then what if he says, no, can't pay taxes to Caesar? You're defying Rome. In fact, it says that they sought to deliver him, verse 20, to the power of the authority of the governor, and then later on they would lie about it and say, this man doesn't pay his taxes. Certainly that's not what happened. So what does Jesus do? Again, this is they don't know the law. They're certainly not honest. But what does Jesus do? Get a denarius. What's on it? Caesar's image and inscription. And then they said that Caesar's... So he says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but to God's the things that are God's. Now, this is not exactly what they had hoped. He doesn't say, pay taxes to Caesar. He frames it in a true and consistent context. Render to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God's the things that are God's. Their idea is that it's one way or the other, that you either betray Rome or you betray God in paying your taxes. But what do we read throughout the rest of the New Testament and what they should have known already about the governing authorities? They exist because God allows them to exist. In fact, in John 19 and verse 11, he would tell Pilate that you wouldn't even have power to do anything if it wasn't God giving you that power, if I didn't give you that power. And so when he says, render to Caesar, Caesar's, and God, God's, those two things go hand in hand. So when you're paying taxes to Caesar, you're actually obeying God. They didn't think that because they didn't know the law. You see that? Remember Daniel? When did he serve? Under captivity, right? And it says that he was faithful. And it wasn't talking about his faithfulness to God in that passage, because he was appointed to great positions of authority within those heathen governments. He was faithful and trustworthy as a citizen, as one who is captive under their regime. And so you serve God in this way as well. Now you got some Sadducees, and I've done my normal thing and left us with no time, so sorry, no comments or questions with this. The Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection. They also don't believe in spirit, and they don't believe in angels. And there is a law in the law of Moses called the Levirate law. That's what it's referred to, from a Latin word meaning brother-in-law. And the idea is that for the man's name to continue, if he dies without any children, then the brother-in-law marries his wife and has children. And so the Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection. And they offer up this ridiculous hypothetical. And that's usually what hypotheticals are when people are questioning the truth. They're ridiculous. They're unrealistic. It doesn't happen this way. Where 7 men, one dies, the brother marries his wife, he dies before having children, up to the 7th. And so you got this woman who had 7 husbands. And when she dies, in the resurrection, who's she going to belong to? And Jesus tells them in Matthew's gospel, you're mistaken not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. You don't understand the Scriptures about the resurrection, nor about this, and about marriage, and you don't know God's power in regard to the resurrection. You doubt it, and you doubt that He would be able to do this. And so this is, he says in verse 35, or verse 34, about the sons of this age, marriages. It's a physical thing. Sons of this world is how chapter 16 frames that phrase. But those who are worthy to attain that age, the spiritual age, the resurrection of the dead, they don't marry or are given in marriage. It's a spiritual resurrection. And marriage is a physical thing. So your whole hypothetical is a moot point. They can't die anymore as the brothers died and as the wife died. because they're sons of God and sons of the resurrection. Now then he uses what is called by us from time to time necessary implication. He mentions the burning bush passage, which is in Exodus chapter 3, where long after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are dead, you have God telling Moses, and Moses recording it later on as he writes Exodus, that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, if there's no spirit and they died, according to the Sadducees, they don't exist anymore. But he says presently, currently, as Matthew and Mark record, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that they still are alive and exist. And if you see anything about the creation of the human body, you read about the body and its purpose in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, you understand that it is God's will that we have a body, physically now, spiritually later, and they're disembodied spirits, and they're alive, awaiting a resurrection. And Jesus says Moses shows that there is a resurrection by what he records God saying in this passage, because he's not God of the dead, he's God of the living, and they're still alive. And so Jesus uses necessary implication. Now, Luke's gospel does not record that third question about which is the greatest commandment, and that would be a good other study, but Luke doesn't record it. The scribes, some of them say, "Teacher, you have spoken well," and then they dared not question him anymore. I'm teaching Sunday, so we'll be good, and I'll start there with verse 41. Appreciate your attention.